Hello, my name is Mark Saunders, and this YouTube video presentation is on evaluating your interview practice. Other video presentations are on the channel Mark Saunders on Research Methods, and you can see the link on the bottom left hand side of this screen. In this video presentation, we're going to start by looking at reflection and reflexivity and reflective questions you can ask yourself when evaluating your interview and practice. We're then going to look at ways of looking at evaluating interactions between you and the interviewee in your interviews. And we're going to be looking at a conversation space map and the patterns and challenges of speech between you and the interviewee and how you can evaluate this using the conversation space map. We're also going to be looking at how do you assess the language you've used in your interviews, and in particular its cleanliness, and then how to look at a clean language rating. And we're going to finish with messy reflexive questions, so other questions you can ask yourself about your interviewing practice. And obviously there'll be some further reading at the end. So let's start with reflection and reflexivity. Reflection is a process of observing your own, in this case, interview practice and examining the way you do things. And it starts with a concrete experience, so your experience of actually having undertaken or doing an interview. You then observe what you've done and reflect on that experience. Once you've done that, you actually look at what have you learnt from that experience. So your abstract conceptualization, you're learning what you would do the same and what you would do differently. And then the next time you undertake an interview, you have active experimentation. You try out what you've learned. Reflexivity is this self-examination. It's the evaluation and interpretation of your attitudes and beliefs and reactions to data and findings. So your reaction to your interview and practice and what you've done, your interactions with your research participants or interviewees, and the acknowledgement of how you've asked questions, your body language, and the intonation of your voice, and the place in which you've undertaken an interview, all how these and many other things actually affect the research process and the outcomes. So in effect, how the way you conduct the interview affects the data you've got and the outcomes from that. Stephanie Reisner, in her paper, which we actually give the reference to at the end of this presentation, provides a really useful diagram summarising your reflexivity, research reflexivity, when undertaking quantitative interviews. And it starts off with your actual interview in practice. And for reflexivity to take place, you engage critically with what you've done. So you actually look at the interactional challenges between yourself and the interviewee, and you actually reflect on what's happened. And in doing so, you get some really important insights into your practice and your role and position as a researcher asking the questions and the interviewee or participant role in answering them. And hopefully, if you do this well, you'll be critical of your own practice. And you'll move to a stage of recursion. And this is where you identify and define the problems with your own practice and start to develop in the solutions. And you'll be doing this by looking at the minutiae, very specific problems, perhaps the tone of voice, or the way you actually might have been biased in the way you ask questions and saying, how can I do this better? And what will happen then is these new insights will help you to address the interactional challenges between yourself and the interviewee, between you as the researcher and your participant, and you'll amend your interviewing practice. We're now going to look at some tools to help you do this. We're going to start by looking at reflective questions you can ask yourself after you've conducted an interview. So you've got your transcript or your audio recording of it. And you can start by looking at the language, the words you use to ask questions, the tone of voice, and any jargon. Was this appropriate for the participant or the interviewee? When you ask probing questions to find out more detail, did they actually enable you to find out more detail or improve your understanding in the explanation that your participant gave you? Looking at your questions, were they leading or biased? And we'll talk more about this when we look at clean language later on. Was the order in which you asked the questions appropriate for the participant? Not appropriate for you, but for the participant. Was your question overzealous in terms of pressing for responses? Did you keep on pushing and pushing and pushing, making the participant uncomfortable because you shouldn't be doing that? Did you, in asking your questions or in responding to what your participant said, give an idea of your own views on things, thereby perhaps introducing bias? As your participants answering, how did you show that you were listening attentively? Did you have a pen and perhaps write notes? Were you nodding? Were you saying, interesting, and things like that? What non-verbal cues were you using? And then, as you were hearing these responses from your participant, how did you test that you were actually understanding them in the way that the participant meant you to understand them? And then finally, thinking ahead to when we look at conversational space analysis, were you dominant in terms of the amount of talking you were doing, or was it your participant? It should be your participant who dominates. One way we can look at our own interview practice is to look at a conversation space map. And here we have an example of one here. The ideas of conversation space map were developed by Stephanie Reiser, and they're read from the bottom of the diagram upwards. So the start of the interview is at the bottom, and as we move up we get the different utterances. Each line on the left or the right represents the number of words uttered by, on the left, the interviewer, on the right, the participant. And we see a pattern approaching. So if we look at this carefully in this diagram, the first thing we see is a long, short pattern where it's long in terms of the interviewer saying more and short from the participant. So this is quite often the case early on in the interview when the interviewer is explaining the study, the confidentiality statements and the like. As we move forward, we see short, long patterns with short from the interviewer and longer from the participant as they respond to open questions. And this is a good pattern to see. You're allowing the participant to do more of the talking. Things can change though. And we can sometimes see long, short patterns. These tend to occur when the interviewer doesn't word the questions that well, and so the participant responds with a short sentence asking for further clarification. We then move forward through the interview and we see short pattern. This is normally where the interviewer is asking a closed question, so a question which is expected to give a short answer. And then finally we see a long at the end where we're discussing key ideas and bringing the interview to a close. Now let's look at these interaction patterns in more detail and the challenges. So we'll start off with the short. As we said, this is at the start of the interview and it's very helpful for collecting demographic data, for seeking clarifications and for interruptions. The trouble is with these short interactions is you're not establishing a clear flow of the interview and your participant may well not actually be engaging in the research and opening up to give those longer, more detailed answers. When we look to long-short interactions, so long from the interviewer and short from the participant, this can be when you as an interviewer are putting a question in context, but it tends to also indicate that the participant is reluctant to respond. So your challenge here is that you're dominating the interview when it should be the participant. And when you're doing most of the talking, a problem can be that you tell the participant too much about yourself and your own views and then lead to the bias in the interview. The ideal is the third row of this table, short-long, where you as an interviewer are saying few words and your respondent, or your participant, is saying a lot more. And here what tends to be happening is you're eliciting more detail in answers through follow-up questions, and hopefully you've got a talkative participant. Here we see participant dominance, which is what we want, but what you have to be careful of here is to be able to phrase your questions in such a way as to enable the participant to respond but not for introducing bias. And sometimes you have to be able to ask a question, a closed question, to actually stop the participant from carrying on talking. Long patterns, so a long question and long answers, tend to be, or signify rather, establishment of dialogue amongst equals. It's when you're discussing key ideas. And trouble is here is that what you're really doing is exchanging ideas in a discussion rather than interviewing to find out. Next, we're going to start to look at clean language. Clean language is the extent in which the language in your question constrains or enables the participant to respond from within their own world. So in other words, it's all about not introducing bias into the interview. So not introducing your metaphors and your descriptive ideas into the interview. So everything can then come from the interviewee or the participant. So a clean language question asking about attributes could be something like, and what kind of a is that? Where X is an interviewee's own words. And is there anything else about X you might like to tell me? If you're looking at reflexivity, and how do you know about X? Or, and that's X like what? So you're actually trying to get the participant to come up with their own metaphors. We can actually rate how clean our language is in interviews by looking at a scale. And what we have here is a variety of different ratings in terms of how clean the language we're using is. And what we see straight away just by looking down the left-hand column here is that quite often language can be clean, but it's not difficult to be slightly leading, and that may or may not be problematic, as we can see on the right-hand side. But a classically clean language is when the question only uses universal constructs and what words that the participant has said. So if participants mention something, we can use the same words back to them, and that is completely clean. When we recap on what a participant has said and use their own words back to them with no introduced content or presupposition or evaluation, again, what we're doing here is not introducing any unclean language at all. So we're doing what is called a clean and repeating back. Contextually clean language is when we introduce a topic or theme as a new theme, but we don't actually contextualize it and give it the detail which would actually start to introduce bias. And so again, we say that that's minimally unclean. And we can do that for the topic, or we can also do it for the logic. So in terms of that, we're staying within the logic of how the participant is describing things, and we're not again introducing content, presupposition or evaluation. Where we start to have problems is when the language we use is mildly leading, when questions or statements suggest or imply an answer, or the way that we'd like our respondent to answer. However, we call it mildly leading is when we get the answer back from our participant. It doesn't suggest that their responses have been biased by what we've said. So we say here that unclean language is present, but we don't have doubt the way in which the answer has been given, and we don't think it's actually biased the responses. Strongly leading is when the question or statement suggests or implies an answer, and then the participant answers in a way that looks like they're trying to answer to please or to use the answer we've suggested. So in effect, their answer is raising doubts of authenticity. Here we say that unclean language is present and we have reason to doubt the responses that we're being given. We're now going to consider a series of broader, messy reflexive questions. These are ones which look at the more wider context in which the interviewing is undertaken. So what place is interview location? Who chose it? Was it the participant or yourself? Does it have an impact on the sorts of answers that the participant might give? Does the location have a particular meaning to the participant or the interview? So it might, for example, be a place where disciplinary interviews have been undertaken, which again would have negative connotations for the participant. What's the cultural relation between the interviewer and the participant? This could impact on the sorts of answers. If the interviewers undertaking interviews at work, do the cultural norms of work actually impact on the sorts of answers that might be given by the participant? What they say and what they don't say? Similarly, think of the relative issues of status, you as an interviewer and your participant, the differences in gender or age, and how might this affect what's being said or not said? Stop for a while and think, how do you as a researcher know what is not being said? So what do those silences mean? What's being left out? And then when you start to summarise the interview, how do you decide what to leave out, what seems important, and also how are you going to summarise the data you've collected? Let's now look at the quality of the findings from the qualitative interviews. And rather than using validity and reliability, which are much more positivistic and quantitative criteria for evaluating findings, we're going to look at alternatives. And the first of these, developed by Lincoln and Goober, is transferability. One could argue this is similar to external validity, but what we're looking at here is, can we generalise to theory from our findings? How believable are our findings by others, excluding the participants? We can look at credibility, in other words, internal validity, if we're looking at validity and reliability. And here we're looking at how plausible are our findings to the participants who actually gave us the data. We can also consider the dependability of our findings, and this is down to the quality of our questioning, so partly our clean language, and thinking also of the interactions and the short and long ideas, as we would see in those diagraphs. And also it's about us being reflexive as interviewers and actually looking at where we did go wrong and saying we need to be careful with these aspects of findings. And finally, it's about showing the confirmability of what we found, so showing that our findings and our interpretations are grounded in the data, and crucially that we've checked what we found with our participants. I'd like to finish by just giving a few select reasons. The first of these, by Ken Lee and colleagues, talks about clean language and researcher reflexivity. Courton Abbas's paper talks about the issues of having these messy reflexive questions. Lincoln and Goober is about the different quality criteria to validity and reliability, which we just spoke about. Then we have Reisner's paper on conversational space mapping, and finally chapter 10 of my book with Adrian and Phil talks about how to undertake interviews.